What's up, guys? Welcome to Facing River Cbets in Position. This is the population analysis module. So through the theory session and example session, we're looking at spots where we're essentially trying to bluff catch where possible against a triple barrel. The name of the game here, if we summarize in very broad brushstrokes, is that we're really trying to find spots where we can cool down with a one pair type holding, usually top pair. And in some situations, it's not going to be okay, but if we can find those spots where we can bluff catch something like top pair mid kicker, top pair weak kicker, then it's going to be pretty good for our faulty river cbet stat. It's not going to be super high. We're not going to be exploitable. It's going to be good for our red line overall. Most importantly, it's going to be plus EV if we can find these marginal bluff catches. Let's take a look at the population data. So we're going to start with how often, in general, the player pool is triple barrel bluffing OOP. More specifically, we're interested in the bluff to value ratio. This is the stars 200L data. So we take a look at that river cbet OOP and take a look at the overall is weak percentage. We can see 26%. So this is how often the player pool is showing up with bottom pair or weaker. Now this is not including mid pairs, so the potential merges in the triple barrel range, which are also going to allow us to potentially call this something like top pair. In fact, if we have a look at the overall distribution here, we've got 14% air, so those are the typical bluffs. Ace high 6% also bluffs. So we have 20% bluffs. Low pair, we probably count that as a bluff as well. That's how we get the 26 is weak. Now mid pair, we don't really know what's happening here. We don't know whether a player is trying to value bet or whether they're turning the hand to a bluff or whether they're just betting because they think they have the best hand. We don't know why a player is merging in a given instance, but we do know it allows us to bluff catch even wider. So we can see mid pair is about 8% of the time. Now that already gets us to 34%. So without taking into account any additional variables, a top pair type hand is going to be good 34% of the time. Now, if we have a look at specific sizing information, because we might think, well, how often do we need to be good? What are our pot odds going to be on average? They're probably going to be somewhere around 30%. We like to maybe add an extra 5% on top of that, just to take into account any dispersion that happens as a result of blocking effects, any uncertainty. The rake, which is certainly not going to be something we're going to ignore. It's going to add a couple of percent on. So if we say we need 35% equity and any top pair is good at least 34% of the time, that pretty much tells us that we should be bluff catching with top pair facing triple barrel. Now it's going to depend on the exact situation. So there are going to be spots where it's not going to be correct to call top pair against a triple barrel. Could be, for example, like early position formation, draw completing runout, those kind of things. But you can get a pretty good idea of why we can't just go around folding top pair every time we face a triple barrel. So if we take a specific sizing point, for example, let's have a look at the data for half pot. Because we know that half pot, we're going to have 25% required on the call. If we had our customary 5%, let's say we're going to need about 30% equity to make the call after we take into account the blocking effects and the rake. So we've got 18, taking us up to ace high. Low pair, that's going to take us to 25. Mid pair is going to take us to 34%. So what did we learn from this? If we're facing a half pot bet, it's just definitely not going to be correct to be folding top pair, assuming the other variables are all somewhere in an average region. And this is implying we should be bluff catching with mid pair some of the time against a half pot. If we have a look at the slightly larger bet sizing, let's take the 80% to pot size. This is generally where we consider the danger zone to be. And we know we're going to need up to 33% equity to make the call here. If we add our 5% due to blocking effects and rake, that's going to take us to around 38% required equity to make the call. So let's see where the 38% line gets drawn here. We've got 14% air, ace high 5%, that's 19. 22 including low pair, 26 including mid pair, 31% including top pair weak kicker, 34% including top pair second kicker, and then 39% top pair top kicker. So pretty reasonable simplification here is that even top pair to kicker is probably not good enough to call a triple barrel when that sizing is within the 80% to pot size region. So you can see it's definitely going to be correct to start folding all one pair hands when villain sizes up. Well, of course, you can see that with this math, the overpair would still be a call. So maybe we can say every top pair, but over pairs we might consider calling against the triple barrel. Okay, let's take the sizing in the middle. So we know this is going to be somewhere around 27 to 30% required equity to make the call. Let's add our customary 5%. So 35% required here for a bluff catch. So we've got air 18%, 25% including ace high, 29% including low pair, 31% including mid pair, top pair weak kicker. So what we can see is we definitely just can't bluff catch any top pair with reckless abandon. We are really thinking about a game of kickers here, and we might just want to bluff catch something like top pair second kicker plus, although top pair weak kicker may occasionally be a call. And once again, this is ignoring any variables, so the way this actually translates is on a draw completing run out, we definitely care about a kicker, and we may be folding stuff like top pair second kicker, but on a draw bricking run out, we might just call every top pair weak kicker. So these are just average values we're getting. But it should give you a very rough idea. Against half pot, we really don't want to fold top pair. Against 80% to pot size, we're actually pretty comfortable just folding every top pair. And even over pairs aren't that great of a bluff catching prospect. And then we have this 2/3, which is kind of more of the decision point with a top pair type hand where we actually are thinking about it, but it's going to depend on the other variables as well. Let's just check out the underbet sizing. So you can see in this kind of situation, we're obviously going to need less than 25% in this case. Let's say that our bluff catching is going to be at 25% plus, assuming we've added the customary 5%. So 15, 21 for low pair. So most of the time a mid pair is going to be a call. Occasionally it's going to be a fold. But we definitely would never fold top pair in this spot. This is kind of the decision point for second pair, I guess, facing this small sizing of less than 40% pot. Okay, so let's have a quick look at some of the profile-based analysis for this situation. So typically we would expect the recreational profiles to be bluffing more. So the logical thing to check first is if we run the analysis on a pink tag, what kind of bluffing frequency are we going to get? Should probably also just take a note as well of what all opponents was, just so we have a point of reference. So I'm just going to head back temporarily to all opponents, have a look at the flop cbet OP. Let's see which value is going to make most sense. I think because we are comparing across profiles, we're just going to take this 26% weak as our point of comparison. It might be better to... Actually, let's take the mid pairs as well. Let's actually fire up a WordPad document. Because obviously the is weak is not the determining factor in terms of whether we can call with top pair. And like we said, that's probably one of the main things that we're focusing on. So what we'll actually do is we'll take the is weak value and then add the mid pair value. Okay, so overall, and we'll just put a title here just so we're very clear and we don't forget what we're trying to do here. So we're going to put is weak plus the mid pair category. And what this is going to tell us is essentially how often we should be calling with top pair against this profile, or whether we should be calling with top pair against this profile. So can we call with top pair is basically what we're figuring out here. So if we go to overall, we can see that the is weak is 26 and the mid pair is 8%. So we can see a surprising amount of merging there. In fact, I think what we'll do is we'll just take a note of the mid pair category, because this might give us an indication of how often a specific player profile is merging. So I wonder if that value would be higher for the pink tags. Let's see what we can find. ATM says, do you take into account sizing on the previous street, like flop 1/3, turn 2/3, river half? Yeah, absolutely. And it's just going to be another variable that we want to factor in. Basically, the smaller our opponent makes it on the earlier streets, the more likely he is to be bluffing. So there's a pretty big difference between 1/3 flop, 1/3 turn, pot size river, and pot size flop, pot size turn, pot size river. And we can analyze that to some extent because we've got this sizing. And when we see sizing here, this is not river sizing, this is flop sizing. So what we can do is get an idea of how often someone is bluffing the river, given that they cbet the flop 10% pot, for example. Or how often they're bluffing the river, given that they bet 90% pot on the flop. So of course, this doesn't allow a 3-street plan because this is only filtering by flop sizing. So you can break down by 2 streets. We can break down by turn and river sizing. So how would we break down by flop and river sizing, or turn and river sizing? Well, in fact, flop and river, potentially, and flop and turn, but not turn and river. What do we mean by this? Well, here, for example, we've got the flop sizing. And then if we bring up the pop-up and the river stat, we can break this down by the river bet sizing. So you can see we can break it down by 2 streets, but we can't break it down by 3 streets. Hand2Note's just not going to support that kind of analysis. I mean, it might do, but you'd have to break everything down in a very specific way so that Hand2Note could handle it. But yeah, it's a variable that should be taken into account. We're probably not going to look at that too much in this session, but this is how you analyze for that. And I've given you the basic takeaway, the pattern you'd expect to see, which is smaller bet sizings on the earlier street result in a higher bluff to value ratio on the river. Okay, so this is now the pink tag. Let's have a look at the frequencies on the river. First of all, we can see it's now 33 weak. And remember, this doesn't take into account mid-pair. Okay, so this is pretty crazy, actually. Let's just bring up our Word document. So this is overall. Pink tag. So we've got 33 is weak. And remember, this value, the first value we're writing is actually the is weak plus the mid-pair category. You can see there's a huge 15% mid-pair on the pink tag category. So 33 plus 15 is actually 48%. See, it's really kind of insane against this particular profile. And then the mid-pair category of that was 15%. So you'll see a huge amount of over-merging that's going on here. Like, definitely some of these will just be the player betting because they don't really know what they're doing. They don't understand the game. And you'll see that what we'd expect to see is this 8% for the overall population is only so high because the recreationals are weighting it upwards to higher values. Because 15% merges. 48%, that's crazy. So, like we said, this is how often is top pair good is what we're really looking at here. How often is top pair good? Can you imagine top pair being good 48% of the time on average when you face a triple barrel from a pink tag when they're OP? And then can you imagine folding top pair weak kicker against a triple barrel from a pink tag? And just think about the size of that error, given that we only need 30% and we have 48% equity in the spot due to the sheer amount of merging that's taking place. Even if we remove the merges, we may potentially have a call. Okay, when we say 30%, I guess let's call it 35%. Again, we're going to add 5% for rake and blocking effects, but you can see 48 versus 35. It's like 13% more equity than we actually require. So folding is definitely going to be a considerable mistake against this kind of profile. Let's have a look at the green tag next. Or in fact, let's see. Yeah, let's have a look at the green tag, see what we get. Rupmer says, about ATM's last suggested sizing, how do you respond to villain lowering his bet size on the river? Well, we bluff catch wider, right? You know, if someone reduces their sizing on the river, we bluff catch wider. We've just seen that in the population data. If they bet large on the flop, bet large on the turn, and then bet smaller on the river, we're still going to give that river bet more than the usual amount of respect because we face such large bets on the flop and turn. So in the same way that the earlier street play is going to influence our decision on the river when facing a large river bet sizing, same kind of thing is still going to influence our play. So we bluff catch much wider against small flop bet, small turn bet, small river bet, compared to what we bluff catch against the same size river bet, but now we're facing an overbet on the flop and turn, for example. So we just take everything into consideration when we're deciding whether to bluff catch. Yes, we do look at the river sizing primarily, but how we treat that river sizing is going to be weighted based on the sizings we've experienced on the flop and turn. Now, most of the analysis we're doing right now is not taking into account the early street sizing. So you'd have to run specific analysis based on that, which we just discussed. We've shown you how you could do that. Right now, we're just having a look at profile-based analysis, though. So let's have a look at the result of the green tag. And let's go to river cbet OOP. So we can see 19% weak, and then the mid pair, you could still, there's a lot of merging going on here, but this does seem like a considerable drop for the green tag. So let's just make a note of this. So if we're going to add the values for the is weak, which is 19 in this case, and then mid pair, which is still 15. So you can see this kind of profile is still pretty confused about the range that they should be betting on the river. There's some obvious polarization errors happening here for the green tag as well. But remember, this category includes some of the weak regs, and they simply may just not be bluffing as much as the pink tags. So you can see there's a definite difference between pink and green tag and how often we expect the top pair to be good. Anyway, 19 plus 15 is going to be 34%. It actually ends up pretty similar to the overall. The only difference is the quality of that range is considerably weaker than overall because of all this merging that's taking place. Okay, let's have a look now at the reg profiles. So we're going to have a look at the red tag first of all. We are expecting there to be less merging with these kind of profiles, and we do expect them to slightly underbluff relative to the overall population. So that's one of the, I guess, kind of ironies, is that, you know, we sometimes might find that the recreational profiles are actually closer to correct bluffing frequencies than the regs. And there are definitely plenty of regs who are relatively weak tight on the river and just not bluffing enough. So we've got the red tag loaded up. Let's see how good the regs are in the stars 200L pool. So we can see 22 weak, and let's see if our prediction about the merging is correct. Yes, it is. You can see the low pair category drops to 5%. We basically just don't expect to see mid pairs bet here. That's why we keep referring to the mid pair category. Top pair might be bet for value, even if it's an underbet sizing. Low pair might be turned into a bluff, but mid pair, it's really not supposed to bet a lot of the time in this spot. I'm sure there are exceptions if you're playing around with a GTO solver, for example, but a high percentage in that mid pair category often means a player is playing badly in this spot. So it makes sense. So when we run the analysis for reg profile, we're going to see a much lower value for that mid pair region of 5%. So we're actually getting 27% total, which is a pretty significant drop. So we really just don't need to be bluff catching as wide against this kind of profile. So what this means is that a top pair is going to be good 27% of the time, and assuming our target is 35%. So we'll just take a note of here. Target to bluff catch top pair equals 35% roughly. So we're going with 30 plus 5%. We're not supposed to bluff catch top pair against a red tag. Okay. General takeaway here. The reason why top pair does well enough to bluff catch in some spots is because you could just see how much equity we have against the pink and green tags. Red, not so much. If you've got someone labeled as a pretty snug reg, well, let's see, when do we actually get to 35% equity using the overall data here? We've got 18, 22, 27, 32, 36. It's actually around the top pair, top kicker region. So, you know, when you think about our typical standard tight advice of you need 2 pair plus, or you need maybe top pair, top kicker sometimes, well, that really applies if you're playing against a red tag. So a lot of our bluff catching is going to be against the weaker players in the pool, the guys we've identified with green or pink. Now let's have a look at the cyan tag. So we do expect the cyan tag to be a little bit more risk averse. So we might Probably still see a low amount of merging because these are still reg profiles, but we might see a slightly higher bluffing frequency. These guys are a bit more risk averse. They have a wider range as well, presumably reaching the river, so they have a larger selection of natural bluffs. So we've got 24% weak here. Let's have a look at the merging. So you can see 5%, so pretty much the same as the red tag. So these are still reg profiles, but you can see the aggression, the bluffing aggression is a little bit higher for the cyan tags. So we actually have 29% here and 5% merging. But you can see we still struggle here to actually bluff catch top pair against this kind of profile as well. So whether or not we are able to bluff catch against these profiles is going to depend on other variables such as the sizing and formation. But by default, we don't have to bluff catch top pair against these profiles. Let's just see where they're going to start bluff catching on average. So we've got S 16, 21, 24, 29, 35. So you can see we can bluff catch a bit wider. We kind of reach a conclusion that here it's possibly top pair top kicker, and here it's possibly top pair second kicker. But it's pretty similar. So we see slight increase in aggression on the river from the cyan tags because they have that wider selection of natural possible bluffs. Red tags, not so much. Now we generally don't get a good sample on the orange tag when we're looking at the 200-node pool. So depending on how tight the pool is, we may or may not get good data here. We'll just have a quick look, but I suspect we're just going to lack sample. Either way, these guys are just really not going to be bluffing. Let's just take a look. We don't even have sample here, actually, for the orange tag, so we'll ignore that for now, but just know that these guys really are not going to be bluffing, and you can call even tighter than you can against the red and cyan tag, so it's going to be 2 pair plus at the absolute minimum, maybe even tighter in some cases. Okay, so that was the profile analysis. Let's take a quick look at some of the texture / runout analysis for this spot as well. So I'm going to go back to the overall data for this. And we're just going to discuss some of the assumptions we made in the theory and examples in terms of which kind of textures are going to be bluffed the most. Now, if we start with the flop textures, then we'll move on to the runouts after that. So texturally, when we see the boards with a high card, we're less likely to experience that high bluff to value ratio on the river. So if the board comes down ace high and villain triples, he's going to be a bit stronger and bluffing a bit less. Whereas if the board comes down 10 high, we can experience a much higher bluff to value ratio on the river. Let's just see if we can demonstrate that with the data. So this is with an ace high flop. So although we're looking at a river spot, this is an ace high flop, okay, regardless of the run out. So we're just going to have a quick look at the is weak values, which, as we've discussed, don't necessarily tell us the whole picture because there's some merging going on. But purely how often does our opponent show it with bottom pair or worse? You've only got 17% weak here on the ace high texture. We've got 9% of merging, which would take us to 26. But you can see most top pairs are really going to struggle to call in this spot. Now as we make our way down, king high, so we started off with 17. We're now upgraded to 19% weak. Queen or jack high, 25% weak. 10 to 9 high, 33% weak. And then low, which is 8 high and lower. On the flop, you know, so we could see like an ace or a king on the turn, for example. But you've got 33 for 10 to 9 high, and then for low, you've got 34. Now, the thing that I like about this is there's just such an obvious, clear progression here in bluffing frequencies. Like, you can't really attribute this to sample size or anything like that because we just see it again and again. 17. Hold on. Actually, 27 there. I'm not sure if I'm looking at 25 for the queen to jack high. Not sure if I checked the wrong stat there because I had 19, right, for the king high. So not sure what I was looking at before. Maybe I was looking at the flop or something. Yeah, I was looking at the flop. Okay, so my bad there. there is a spike in king high. So actually we don't have a super clean pattern, but I will attribute that to variance because so often we do actually have a clean pattern here. You got 17, king high, which is now 27, which is a bit higher than we'd expect. And then 25 for queen to jack high. So we'd expect the king high to be in between the ace high and the queen jack high, but it's not quite. That's probably variance, I would guess. But aside from that one outlier, you can see the smooth progression we have across different boards, where the lower the flop, the higher the amount of bluffing we're going to experience on the river. Mr. Boltzer says, if we expect a particular reg to triple barrel at a high frequency, would we fold our weakest top pairs on the turn? Generally, no. But it does depend on why the reg's barreling a lot. See, the thing is, if someone's barreling a lot, it implies that they're barreling wide, and it implies that they will have a high bluff to value ratio on the river, which means we can just call with the intention of calling the river. However, if someone barrels the river at high frequency because they're a nit, and anytime they barrel the turn, they just have something very strong, then we would fold the turn because we can't bluff catch the river because the bluff to value ratio is not there on the river. So you can see it actually depends. Why is our opponent triple barreling at a high frequency? Is he triple barreling because he's aggro and wide, or is he triple barreling because he just has the nuts every time? Okay, so let's think a little bit about runout. So the difference between texture and runout is texture is obviously the flop. Runout is what are the ton of river cards. We're going to focus on river cards. And what we find is, in some ways, it's the opposite to the flop observation. We find that when the river is an overcard, it's actually more likely to be bluffed. So when we get a situation where the flop texture is low, we actually then kind of like it if the turn or river card becomes an overcard, because according to the data, it actually increases the likelihood that our opponent is bluffing. Whereas if a flop is low and stays low, it actually decreases the chance that our opponent is bluffing. It's still pretty likely he's bluffing anyway, just by virtue of the fact that it was a low texture. But it's not as good as a situation where we get a low board and then the turn and river come high cards. Let's just have a look at that. Actually, before we do that, let's just have a look at the different types of texture as well and how often the river's bluffed. So, code red, 21 weak on the river. Dynamic, 25 weak. Semi-dry, 27 weak. Dry will probably drop down again, 11 weak. So what we actually have is we have this bell curve where when the flop gets very drawy, like dynamic, code red, or even semi-dry, then we often find that, if it's very, very drawy, like a code red, you might find that we don't experience that many bluffs on the river. But when there's lots of draws that can potentially brick, like dynamic and semi-dry, we have this spike in bluffing frequency. When we get down to dry again, we don't experience that many bluffs on the river. So there's a little bit of a bell curve there, where super drawy boards where a whole bunch of stuff has already got there are not necessarily the best. We actually like this dynamic and semi-dry because there's the bigger percentage chance that our opponent has a draw, and that draw could potentially go on to brick. Whereas the thing with a code red, although that's still true on a code red texture, someone could have a draw that goes on to brick, they also just have a bunch of hands that have already got there. Whereas on semi-dry and dynamic, there are less hands that have already got there. Now, although that's true on the dry texture, there aren't really too many hands that have already got there. The problem is there aren't really a lot of natural bluffs / semi-bluffs. So, a dry texture triple barrel is not great for us either. So we actually like it to be somewhere in the middle. So we can set up that perfect situation where there are a bunch of draws on the flop, everything bricks by the river, then we're going to experience the highest bluffing frequency. Okay, let's move on to our runout analysis. So if we go back to the overall tab for this, so we're not going to take into account the texture, although you could, if you wanted, you could combine two variables. You could have a look at the runout analysis given a certain texture if you had the largest sample size, but we're just going to focus on one variable at a time. So let's have a look at runout. So you can see the different types of textures and the is weak value for a range of runouts for all opponents. Once again, this doesn't tell us the whole picture because we're not looking at that mid pair category here. This is just the is weak value, which is going to be bottom pair and worse. So you can see overcard, and we haven't looked at the other values yet, but there's a spike here at 32%. Because if you look at the aggregate of these, I guess we're somewhere around 25, 26, somewhere around there, maybe 27. Because we've got non-overcard at 25, flush completes at 24, flush bricks at 29, river pairs at 28. So you kind of get a feel that we've got this aggregate value of somewhere around 26, 27. And it might be lower than that once we factor in the extreme runouts, okay? So we've got the extreme plus the unorthodox runouts. So 4 flush is what we classify as an extreme runout. 4 straight we classify as an extreme runout. And look at those bluffing frequencies. Like opponent ends up having low pair and worse 12% of the time in a 4 flush, and bottom pair and worse 15% of the time in a 4 to straight river. Double pairs, you can see 18% of the time they're going to be weak. I guess that basically stands for ace high in the spot. I guess a low pair when that pair just happens to be higher than the low pair on the board as well. Something like that. It's a mid pairs, those kind of things. But yeah, obviously the is weak is just going to be the ace high and the low pair. And the low pair has to be higher than the low pair on the board, obviously, otherwise it gets counterfeited. But you can see these spots are not bluffed at all. So overcard, yes, that's very good for us, and a board bricking is very good for us. So if Hand2Note had the ability to run a filter where we could say it's overcard and flush bricks, then we'd probably see an even higher value than 32. So if we combine 2 positive variables, we get an even higher bluffing frequency. So if we put everything together in terms of, what is the ideal situation for bluff catching in terms of a texture plus runout? This is what we're looking for. We're looking for a flop that doesn't have an ace or a king on, ideally. It's going to be something like queen high and lower. Everything bricks by the river, and the river is an overcard. Now, that should kind of tell us something regarding different types of overcards as well. There are overcards that connect with the board and complete draws. And although those are kind of good because they're overcards, they're not great because they also complete the draws. So the ideal situation would be an overcard that didn't actually connect with the rest of the board. Probably implies that it's maybe not a queen high board, it's maybe something like a jack, 10 or 9 high texture. So jack, 10, 9 high, semi-dry or dynamic, turn or river or both are overcards, but they don't really complete any of the draws out there. That's going to be the perfect situation for us in terms of bluff catching. And then, of course, the other variables we've discussed. We want our opponent to be a pink tag, if possible, and also use that half pot sizing rather than 2/3, or rather than 80% to pot size. So in our mind, if we can construct what the best possible situation looks like for us. In terms of worst possible situation, I guess it's going to be something like an ace high flop, where our opponent triple barrels. And the river brings undercards, and it has to when it's ace high, right? You can't have an overcard run out when you have ace high on the flop, so it's already a given when you have an ace high texture that it's going to be an undercard run out. And we get some kind of extreme run out, so it's either something like double pairs, or it's 4 straights, 4 flushes. Those are going to be the extreme situations where we just know that we're not going to be calling down the top pair. And if we do try and bluff catch with 1 pair in that spot, we're going to be hemorrhaging money. So Rupmer says, does it matter what the pairing card is when we have a river pairs run out in terms of bluffing frequency? Let's have a look at that river pairs. So river pairs does seem to be okay. It doesn't seem like way better than average or anything. And it could depend on the river pair for sure. What we don't have is the ability to analyze that or really know that for certain. So we can make guesses. But the whole idea with the range research is we want a data-driven approach, and it's going to be very difficult to analyze that kind of thing in terms of having the right sample to be able to analyze, which river card pairs and whether that ends up being good for us. So we can't really answer that question with our data. I suspect it has an impact, but I would also just suspect that most river pairing runouts are going to be okay as a bluff, right? So whether it's the bottom, mid, or top card that pairs, I would say you're doing fine as a bluff catch in that kind of situation. I suppose that if I was to guess, and this is just a guess, it's not like data driven or anything, I would guess that it's worse when the top card pairs. And that's just because our opponent has the top pair in his flop and turn betting range, whereas he may not have bottom and middle pair in his flop and turn betting range. A lot of guys have been told that when you have a mid-strength main hand like that, you should be checking. So my best guess is that it's worse when the top card pairs and not really an issue when the bottom or mid card pairs. But I've also trained myself not really to guess. If I don't have a clear answer from the data, then I just ignore that. So I wouldn't really act on that. It's just an assumption, it's a hunch, and sometimes assumptions get us into trouble. That's why we really like digging into the data like this. Okay, so let's have a look now at the formation analysis, so positional. And one of the key concepts that we mentioned in the theory and examples is we have this really special zone, which is the small blind versus big blind situation. We should just be doing a lot of bluff catching in this spot. Now, if we compare the is weak frequencies, we can see that small blind versus big blind has 32% is weak. Now, if we compare the other positions, we expect to see a significant drop-off in terms of how often players are weak from the other positions. So 32 as our base figure. Actually, this is Cbet flop we're looking at now. I should make sure I check the right stat. So yeah, 32 weak. Cutoff versus button, we now drop to 24% weak. So you see there's a good, it's like minimum 5%, I would guess. In this case, it's actually 8% difference. Let's see what the other positions look like. 20% weak. Okay, so even cutoff versus button. You see, cutoff versus button is actually still relatively loose at the 24% weak. Once we get to hijack versus button, we just have this big drop off. There's a big difference between 20% is weak and 32% is weak. Low jack, expect this to be kind of low as well, 20% weak. Hijack versus cutoff, 24 weak. Low jack versus cutoff, 17 weak. And then low jack versus hijack, 22% weak. So definitely some variance there because, we might expect low jack versus hijack to be the lowest, then it's not the lowest in this data set, it's actually 22%. So we would guess there's a somewhat smooth progression, but it does seem that small blind versus big blind is a bit of a spike there where it's significantly better than the other positions. Now you might think, well, why do we get so many good bluffing opportunities, bluff catching opportunities, given that a lot of these is weak frequencies are actually kind of low? It's presumably because there's more triple barrel bluffing that happens in late position. So when you see these big blind versus small blind spots and, cutoff versus button and stuff like that, these are just more common pre-flop configurations. So this ends up being a bigger part of the overall picture. But you can see when we're dealing with these slightly less common pre-flop configurations or pre-flop formations, that there's a big drop-off in terms of how often the river's being bluffed by our out-of-position opponent. And we really start having to bluff catching on the tight side. So this is really going to be one of the very important variables to look at. Just to give you a rough idea, if we just calculate the average of these spots, for example, if we have a look at, we're in the big blind, this is how often the small blind's bluffing. Okay, we're going to use 35% as our required equity, just as a rough ballpark figure. So 25%, 32%, and then you can see that the 35% occurs somewhere in the lower end of the mid-pair category. So we should be bluff catching something like good mid-pairs plus in the BB versus small blind situation. This is why we said in the examples video, we really want to be reluctant to fold top pair here because according to the data, we shouldn't really be folding a lot of our mid-pair hands, facing a triple barrel in this spot. And if we have a look at cutoff versus button, it's still going to be pretty good. It's not going to be as good, but it's still going to be okay. So we've got 19%, 23, 30, And you can see 35% is going to occur somewhere in that top pair weak kicker category. So we can't just call top pair with reckless abandon in the spot, but we can definitely think about making some top pair bluff catches in a button versus cutoff situation, especially if some of those other variables coincide. You know, we have favorable texture, run out sizing, opponent profile, draw brick and run out, stuff like that. But it's not like a close your eyes, call down 3 streets with any top pair in a button versus cutoff situation. But when we start getting to the other spots, I mean, let's have a look. Hijack versus button now, which might on the outset seem like it's kind of similar to button versus cutoff. Let's see what the data says. We've got 8%, 14, 19, 27, 34 top pair weak kicker. What that means is even some top pair second kicker hands don't quite make the cut as a bluff catch in the spot. So we need at least top pair second kicker, and that's for a break-even call. So kind of close to that top pair top kicker required now. Let's just try some of the other spots because there could be some variance here, right? So let's see low jack versus button. Let's see where we end up here. This should be even tighter technically, but I think, well, this is 11 weeks, so this is obviously very tight. I think this might be trending on the low side, but let's add it up. 17, 20, 27. Hold on, I'm looking at turn, all right? There we go, that's more like it, 20% weak. So what I was going to say is that this is actually slightly higher according to the data. No, it's not. It's exactly the same, 20%, okay? Doesn't mean we'll get the same result, though, because it does depend on that mid-pair category. Let's just check it out. 20%, 29%, 38%. So it's kind of telling us that we could actually call with some top pair weak kickers here in the spot. So we're actually getting a slightly wider result in terms of what we can bluff catch. But we have to assume that that's variance because it doesn't make sense we can bluff catch wider button versus UTG than we can button versus hijack. So we're going to treat that as like variance and say that, you know, probably you have to just have top pair top kicker in the spot. This is why we're taking a few spots, by the way, just to see if we can iron out the variance. Hijack versus cutoff, we seem to be getting a relatively wide result here. Let's just tot up the numbers. 17, 24. 31 for mid pair, and then 35% cutoff point ends up somewhere in that top pair weak kicker category. It's a pretty similar result. Top pair second kicker plus low jack versus cutoff. So we're getting 17 weak here. So very tight result. But 10, 17, 24, 30. And then this time the cutoff point's in that top pair second kicker region. So it's really going to be top pair, top kicker plus to be safe. Low jack versus hijack just to complete the circuit. Got 14, 22. Okay, we've lost that. 14, 22, 30, 37. So once again, we get a result somewhere in the top pair weak kicker region for low jack versus hijack, which, you know, the data we've got at the moment seems to be indicating that players in UTG are actually showing up a bit wider than players in the hijack, but we're going to disregard that because it doesn't seem logical. So we're going to attribute that to variance and possibly having a lower sample size in low jack open situations. So you can see it really does make a big difference. Early position formations by default, we're really just thinking about top pair second kicker minimum and then top pair top kicker plus, something like that. But because the BB versus SB and button versus cutoff spots total to be a disproportionate amount of the triple barrel OOP situations, it ends up weighting the overall data to saying that we can actually bluff catch pretty wide with top pairs. So I would say first thing is you get into this kind of situation, what is the formation? Seems to be possibly the most important variable in this spot. Mr. Bolzer says players' ranges can be twice as wide in the small blind compared to EP and MP. I mean, I'm not sure if you talk about the open ranges there or what you're referring to, whether you're referring to the river ranges or what, but I mean, that is part of it. The wider someone's range is, the more natural bluff combos they have. And when someone has more natural bluff combos, you know, stuff that's obvious that it should be turned into a bluff, you know, like a busted 6 high or something like that. The more obvious bluff combos, the more obvious natural bluff combos someone has, the higher their bluffing frequency. It's just a really simple principle that nearly always translates into that higher bluffing frequency. people don't even really open that many 6 high hands from UTG, right? It's much harder for them to have like a busted 9 high on the river after they open from UTG because they don't open as many 9x hands from that spot. And, it all stems from the fact that someone's opening 14% of hands from UTG and then opening who knows what in the small blind, 36, 40, 50, even 100% of hands from the small blind. So it makes sense there's going to be more natural bluff combos on the river. Yeah, in fact, this is what you guys are saying in the chat. I wasn't reading that actually, but what you guys have written has mirrored just what I've said. Mode saying 50% potentially on the small blind, and then Rupama saying even 100% in the small blind. So exactly what I've just mentioned. So yeah, wider ranges equals wider selection of natural bluffs on the river equals higher bluffing frequency. And that concept doesn't just apply to triple barrel OP, it applies to any situation. Someone has a wider range, they have more natural bluff combos, you're probably going to run into a higher bluffing frequency. And this is part of why on a draw completing river, we experience a lower amount of bluffs. Because when a whole bunch of stuff gets there, our opponent has less natural bluff combos for the river. Because the hands that he would have bluffed on the river either get there or pick up a pair. So he just physically can't bluff as much in those spots. Unless he's like a very good GTO player who's deliberately trying to keep that bluff to value ratio balanced, then he's naturally going to bluff more in spots where he has more air combos in his range. Okay, so we normally run the sizing analysis, but we actually did that at the beginning. So what we're going to do now is just hop on over to 3-bet pots. The main thing that we want to take away here is that the analysis we've run for single raise pots is very similar for 3-bet pots. And we can demonstrate that quite easily. If we just have a look at fold cbet in position, let's have a look at cbet OP in 3-bet pots. And let's just have a look at that is weak percentage. And you can see it's up there at 28%. Now we could, I guess, assume that the average sizing is a bit smaller on the river, potentially. It might be. Let's just use 35% as our threshold again. So what is the average bluff catch combo in a 3-bet pot? Well, we've got 11 plus 12, that's 23, plus 6, that's 29, plus mid pair is 36. So where does that leave us? It leaves us around that top pair category. Okay. So we're thinking about bluff catching any top pair. But there are going to be situations where it's just clearly not going to be a bluff catch, and situations where it clearly is going to be a bluff catch. Yeah, I can open the bet size drop down box, no problem. So, based on our knowledge of single raise pots, we could probably make some pretty logical guesses about what we expect to see in a 3-bet pot. For example, if we open this 80% pot size, a logical prediction would be that it's really hard to call down top pair, and we saw in single raised it was over pairs plus. This does seem to be a little bit wider, so let's just see. We know we need about 38 on the call here because, if we say 33 for the pot size bet plus our 5%, let's see where we end up here. So we've got 28, which is surprisingly high, 34, 37 because there's not really so much merging going on here. 39, so you can see top pair weak kicker is right in the middle of that, but it definitely is more of a top pair second kicker kind of spot here. A little bit wider than we'd maybe expect to see for single raised. It's definitely not tighter, as you can see. You might think, well, it's 3-bet pot, we should call it a bit tighter. Actually, according to the data, no, it doesn't work like that. Let's see half pot. Remember, half pot for the single raised was we're just going to call any top pair, really. We're not going to think too much about it. Let's see if that holds true for 3-bet pots. So we've got 22%, 28%, 34% on the mid pair. So top pair weak kicker just gets us there at 35%. The absolute weakest aren't making the cut, but 5/6 of those top pair weak kicker hands are making the cut as a bluff catch, according to our basic calculation there. So you can see we're able to predict things quite accurately based on knowledge of single raise pots. Just to give you another example of how that might work. If we have a look at different runouts, for example, or different opponent types, we're probably going to see the same kind of thing. So if we have a look at river, and let's have a look at the different board textures. So you can see the is weak frequency there. You can see it's highest on overcard and bricked runouts. You got 30% weak on overcard. Remember, it was something like 32 for single raise pots. We've got 30% weak for 3-bet pots. Things brick, flush bricks, 30% weak. Completes 25%. So you can see that drop when draws get there on the river. Then we have our unorthodox and extreme runouts. So you can see the values here don't seem as low. It does seem there's maybe a bit more bluffing going on in 4 flush runouts and 4 straight runouts. Double paired runout seems much higher as well. So I think if anything, it seems to indicate that there might be a bit more bluffing going on in 3-bet pots. But there's certainly not less bluffing going on. We certainly don't need to bluff catch a lot tighter just because we're in a 3-bet pot. Yes, there is more money at stake, but there's also more money at stake for opponents. You know, they're going to potentially be bluffing a bit wider. They can value bet more or less the same range in a 3-bet pot as they can in a single raise pot. Mode is saying players playing L16 or maybe L25, L50, so micro stakes basically. We have to consider even tighter bluff catching ranges, question mark. What I recommend is that you run your own analysis on this, okay? So the whole idea is this is like a template. This is going to give you pretty good, rough benchmarks for what to defend, but player pools are different. And there are definitely some nitty player pools out there at low limits, and there's definitely some very splashy player pools out there at low limits. Stars used to be kind of on the tighter side, but you know, since they screwed everyone over with their rake, you'll actually find that there's a decent amount of fish floating around at the low limit at stars now. So you might find that you don't need to tighten up at low limit stars because, you know, after screwing over half of the regs with their rake adjustments, now there's high distribution of weaker players at the lower limits. So this is why I say run the analysis on your own player pool. Use this as a template. Then after that, fire up Hand2Note, get the Death Star, run the analysis yourself. Okay, this is highly recommended. Yes, it's a decent amount of work. Yes, you got to leave your computer probably for a couple of hours to process the stuff, but this is just such a useful and valuable skill. And you'll find that a lot of players don't have this skill. It's not that it's too hard to do, it's just that maybe they can't be bothered, they don't have the HUD package, they don't have Hand2Note, they don't know how to run range research, they can't be bothered, it takes too long. So my recommendation to just get an instant edge is get Hand2Note, get that star HUD, fire everything up, run the analysis on your player pool. Pay money for the hand histories if you don't have them. You know, visit like HH Dealer, HH Smithy. There's another one as well, a big one that I'm forgetting. It's like HH Mailer or something, I think. I'm just going to run a quick ping tag for the 3-bet pots, and I'm going to take your questions, and then we'll probably wrap things up after that. So let's have a look at flop Cbet OP 3-bet pots. So we are guessing based on our single raise pot analysis, a huge spike in bluffing frequency here for the river. I wouldn't say this is huge, but it is definitely a good 6% higher for 3-bet pots. So let's just see, do we still call down any top pair against the pink tag? Because remember, this doesn't take into account the merging, right? So, and the merging was huge when we look at the single raise pot data. You can see a similar thing happening here, 12% merges for the pink tags. So we've got 25, 34, and then plus a 12%, that gets us to 46% top pairs good against the pink tag. And with our data for single raise, we had something like 48% pot, or 48% equity with those kind of hands. Remember this for the pink tag? We were seeing 46% in 3-bet pots. So you can really see the links here between 3-bet and single raise pots are very strong. If you know how to play in single raise pots, you also know how to play in 3-bet pots facing that triple barrel on the river. Okay, so Mr. Boltzer says, out of the variables we use, opponent's type, size, formation, etc., which ones do you think are the most important? They're all important. It's quite difficult to decide which one is the best because it probably does depend on the situation. I think the biggest thing that we've seen is actually the profiling. If you're dealing with a pink tag, that's biggest, right? But if you're dealing with a cyan tag versus a red tag, then the difference in profile is no longer the biggest consideration. We have to look at some other variable, right? It seems that maybe the second biggest consideration here is the formation. So we start off by looking at the profile, but more specifically, when we say look at the profile, is our opponent a pink tag? Because if our opponent's not a pink tag, then suddenly profile is not the most important thing. So you can see, it's not so easy as just saying which is the most important variable. It depends on which variables are there, essentially. If our opponent's not a pink tag, then maybe the next most important thing to consider is the formation. So profile, then formation. But really, you want to be thinking about all of these. Okay, the goal here is to think about all of the variables. There's only 4 or 5 of them, and you should be able to train yourself to assimilate this number of variables mid-hand. There's no complex calculation here. This is just scenario recognition, and it's quite precise scenario recognition because we take into account a number of variables, but it's not something that we can't do in the space of 5 to 10 seconds. When we analyze a hand after the fact in a session, for example, we might spend 10-15 minutes going through each of the variables, but the process can be done internally in 10 to 15 seconds, the time you need to make a decision in a big pot, for example. So you should be thinking about all of these. You don't want to be in a situation where it's like, oh, okay, I don't have time, so let me just look at profile or just look at runout. You want to look at all of these. They're all important, essentially. That's why we use them as our standard variables. I have a range research report open for 25 NL on stars. The numbers are almost identical to these 200 NL reports. Yeah, this is kind of what I expect to see. And this is why you can use this session as a really good rough benchmark. So if you really can't run your own range research report, or you don't have access to the hand histories for your player pool, which is definitely a legitimate thing that can happen in some networks, is you just can't purchase hand histories. I mean, classic example is PokerStars Zoom. You're probably not going to have 10 million hands of Zoom because data mining Zoom is against terms and conditions, and as a result, nowhere really sells data mined Zoom hands, so you just can't get them. So if you don't have the hands, then you can probably use the stats in this session to formulate your base strategy. But if you do have hands in your own player pool, you should run it. A lot of the times you will find they're kind of similar to these numbers, but other times you might find there are some deviations. I definitely think, microstakes, there are 2 brands of microstakes games. There's the really nitty microstakes games, bot infested, reg infested, high rakeback kind of microstakes games. And then there is the, soft 4 or 5 pink tags in every table microstakes games. And obviously they're going to play completely differently. So you don't want to be like, does this apply to micros? It's not about whether it's micros or mid stakes or high stakes. It's about which room it is and what the most common player profiles are in that room at that specific limit. ATM says, how many hands to be accurate? It depends what you're analyzing, right? If you just want the basic overall stats, you could probably get, if you just want a rough idea of a population, you could just use 300k hands or something. If you want really accurate basic stats, you probably want, 5 to 7 million. If you want to start breaking down by different variables, then you really want like 10 million plus. If you want to start doing really complex stuff, like breaking down by multiple variables at once, such as a river sizing given a flop sizing given a profile, or, a river sizing given a flop texture given a profile, that kind of thing, now's when we're looking at like 20 to 50 million hands to be ideal, I would guess. But we don't usually break things down like that. You'll notice in these sessions, we don't have like a certain variable given another variable. We don't do that kind of analysis. We can kind of predict what the outcome of that will be by just looking at the variables individually. So when we have 2 positive variables, they coincide to form an even more positive situation for a bluff catch, for example. So we don't need to look at a variable given another variable because we just need a huge sample size for it. And it's just not necessary. We can kind of predict the answers to that by analyzing the variables individually, which we can then do with a much smaller sample size. So, if you have, 7 to 10 million hands, you're probably good for most things. If you can get more than that, great. do you think zoom tables would be tighter than reg tables? Generally speaking, the reg tables are fishier than the zoom tables. The zoom tables are softer than they've been in quite a while. There are plenty of fish at the zoom tables, lower limits. You know, even the higher limits as well. There's plenty of fish. You know, they're there. Even in some cases by fish, we might mean weak regs, but there are bad poker players at the table. But reg tables have always been softer than zoom tables. And when we say softer, what that really means is a higher number of pink tags at the tables, which then translates to a higher bluffing frequency on the river. So I would expect if you could compare zoom and reg table data side by side, you would see that the reg table data has a higher bluff to value ratio for that river triple barrel spot. So reg tables are nearly always softer than zoom tables. Regs like zoom tables because they can get in more volume and they can get more rake back and stuff like that. Alright, I think we'll call that a session. Thanks for your attention, guys. Good luck with the grind.